I wasn't in a good place that spring, and I knew it before I turned off the county road and took the washed-out track into Coleman Valley. Dawn sat low and grey over the fir ridges, rain still clinging to every needle, and the whole basin looked like it had been breathing in its sleep. Fog moved in thin bands across the old tailings pile, then thinned enough for the adit cut to show like a dark seam in the mountainside. I had told myself I was there for practical reasons. Close the claim, catalogue what little could be salvaged, post the warnings, file the county paperwork, and stop paying taxes on a dead hole in the ground. That was the language I used because it was clean and measurable. What I did not say out loud was simpler and harder. My father had been dead 3 winters, and I still carried conversations with him that never happened. My son was 15, and our calls had become short weather reports spoken to each other from separate planets. I spent 22 years in copper and hard rock work, mostly underground, and then in oversight once my knees started speaking louder than my pride. I trusted things with weight and tolerance values. Timber either held or failed. Water pressure either stayed manageable or took your footing. Payroll either balanced or it didn't. That kind of life trains suspicion into you in a useful way. Men who jump at shadows don't last long in a drift, and men who chase stories get hurt. My father had no patience for stories either. He ran number 7 like a church and a shipyard at once. No wasted motion, no dramatics, no soft speech unless it was aimed at animals. He could cuss a compressor into behaving, then kneel in the mud to untangle a finch from wire without snapping a twig. I inherited his hands and his temper in equal measure, and I did not inherit his ability to ask for repair when he'd done damage. By the time I learned how to make an apology that didn't sound like a defense brief, he was already gone. The house below the claim had gone hollow in a way I still noticed in my teeth, especially mornings. My divorce had happened years before and mostly without shouting, which somehow made it lonelier. My son, Eli, lived 40 miles west with his mother and stepdad, and none of us were villains in that arrangement. We were just tired people who kept missing each other by inches. We used to fish the creek below the compressor shed when he was small, and he used to ask why mountain water tasted colder than tap water. I had told him mountain water tasted like rock and work. He had laughed and said it tasted like pennies and sky. Somewhere between 12 and 15, he stopped saying odd, beautiful things to me, and I stopped asking questions that required more than yes or no. A primary consideration, if I'm being honest, was shame. I had become a man who could inspect a cracked beam from 30 feet and miss a crack in his own boy from 5 feet away. I parked by the sagging barn and sat in the truck with the engine ticking itself cool, watching rain bead down the windshield. The valley smelled like wet cedar, diesel from my own clothes, and cold mineral runoff from the upper cuts where snowmelt had started early. Spring melt was coming down hard this year. You could see it in seep lines on the lower retaining wall and hear it in the creek's pitch, that constant rough note just below flood. If I delayed another week, number 7 would take on more water than I could manage alone. Old supports would swell, then soften, and what was left of the chamber where Dad kept records could slump. I had gone through the claim map twice the night before, tracing routes with a pencil nub like I could memorize safety into rotten ground. The resulting tension sat right behind my ribs. Close it fast enough to keep it safe, but not so fast. I left the only things I still wanted to bring back. Inside, the kitchen was as plain as ever. A square table scarred by decades of coffee cups and toolboxes, 1 north window, 1 stove that clicked twice before lighting. I set water to boil, peeled off my wet jacket, and stood there listening to pipes complain in the walls. There is a kind of silence that isn't silence at all in old houses. It's wood settling, rain tapping tin, wind taking a trial run around corners. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at Eli's name for a full minute before I hit call. It rang long enough for me to imagine him seeing it and deciding whether he had the energy. Then, voicemail. I heard my own breath in the speaker, too loud. "Hey, bud, it's Dad. I'm up at the claim this week doing closure work. If you want to come Saturday, I could show you where your granddad carved your initials into the bunkhouse rail when you were little. No pressure. Just thought I'd ask." I stopped, listened to myself not saying what I meant, and hung up without sending. I stood there with the unsent message open, then deleted it and set the phone face down beside the sink. By the first week of April, my routine had narrowed to tasks that kept feelings from pooling. Inventory nails and boards, check the mule tack, sharpen the short saw, mark unstable ground, boil coffee, eat when the clock said to eat. Daisy, my old mule, watched me from the lean-to with the patient look only working animals have, that blend of tolerance and judgment. She was grey around the muzzle now, one ear nicked from a long-ago fence wire, and she still shifted to block the wind from me when I stood close enough. I brushed her while rain drummed on the roof and told her things I never mailed to people. "Just 2 days," I said into her neck. "Get in, get the box, get out, close the place right." She leaned her weight into the brush and sighed like she had heard worse plans. There was gentleness in that shed that I did not deserve but accepted anyway. I pulled on dry socks, then boots still damp at the seams, checked my belt lamp, checked spare carbide, checked match tin, checked twine and chalk, and the folded closure notice from the county. I took my father's brass check tag from my pocket and rubbed the stamped number with my thumb before putting it back. Men carry odd talismans when they claim not to believe in talismans. Outside, the rain had dropped to mist, and every boardwalk plank shone dark. The climb to number 7 Adit took 15 minutes if you were fit, and 25 if your right knee had weather sense. I did it in 21. Not because I hurried, but because I refused to stop. Water ran in new channels across the slope, cutting little silver paths through rust-red dirt. Near the portal, Thor had opened fine cracks in the clay bank, each one feeding cold threads into the ditch line. Spring melt never announced itself with drama. It just kept coming, hour after hour, until old assumptions floated away. At the mouth of the drift, I tied Daisy under the overhang where she'd stay dry, gave her feed, and watched her settle. She didn't toss her head or pull at the lead. She stood with ears forward toward the black opening, calm as a porch dog watching weather. I set my palm against her shoulder and felt steady heat under hide. "Same as always," I said, though it wasn't, and we both knew it. The Adit breathed a cold, damp draft across my face that tasted like iron and stone. I lit my lamp, heard the familiar hiss catch, and stepped inside. Number 7 narrowed fast after the first bend. My boots found old habits. Toe down on slick spots. Shoulder turned at the squeeze by the bent rail. Left hand along the wall where shale shelved out rough enough to guide by touch. The timber sets looked worse than in the fall. More dark streaking at the bases. More grain lift where water had worked in and stayed. Drips counted off time from overhead seams. Somewhere deeper, runoff moved with that flat, stubborn sound of water, deciding where it would go, whether you agreed or not. I paused at the chalk mark my father had scratched years back. CC over a crooked line for Clint Coleman or Carl Coleman, depending on who was using it as shorthand. Under my lamp, the mark looked fresh and old at the same time. A man's initials pretending at permanence in a mountain that doesn't care. I set down my lunch pail in the side chamber, where I planned to start clearing debris, and checked the old bracket where we used to hang a spare carbide lantern. Empty, same as last season. Good. I liked it when things stayed where memory put them. I took one slow breath, then another, listening to boot scrape, lamp hiss, and my own lungs working against damp air. Evidence suggested I had come up here to shut a hazard and settle paperwork. The underlying truth was that I had come looking for a shape I could live inside once this place was gone. Work had always been my best argument with grief, and the mine was the last conversation I still knew how to have. I picked up the shovel, set the blade into wet gravel, and started my first cut toward the drainage channel. The first cut came up heavy with waterlogged fines and old splinters, and by the fifth cut my shoulders had found the old rhythm that made thinking optional for a while. I worked the shallow trench a shovel width at a time, lifting muck into a low berm so runoff would favour the side notch instead of pooling under the nearest set of timbers. The ground gave reluctantly. Every bite of the blade released cold that seemed stored for years, mineral and clean and a little bitter in the back of the throat. My lamp pushed a narrow cone over blackened wood, wet rail and wall rock glittering where the moisture caught light. Nothing dramatic happened. Drips fell, water moved. My breath scraped in and out. I kept telling myself that ordinary effort was enough, that this was just closure work and old maintenance done too late. After 20 minutes, I straightened, pressed both hands into my lower back, and listened. Underground, silence is never complete. You always get drips, shifting pebbles, the tiny tick of cooling metal if you've brought tools in from the truck. What unsettled me wasn't noise. It was the pattern of it. The runoff I'd been hearing farther down had thinned to almost nothing, like someone had put a hand over part of the sound. I stood still until my calves started to shake, then shook my head and went back to work. Spring melt rerouted itself every hour. I knew that. Water found easier grades, clogged, broke through, changed its mind. Men who assigned meaning to every change got jumpy, and jumpy men made bad moves around old supports. I sank the shovel again and told the tunnel, "Coming through, old girl, the way my father used to." I made 30 more feet toward the bend where the drift pinched and the timber crown dipped low. The left wall wept steadily there, thin silver threads crossing the shale faces and gathering in a shallow runnel at ankle height. I pulled a chunk of rotten lagging clear, then another, and built myself a little dry spot to kneel on from 2 fractured planks. My gloves soaked through anyway. The damp climbed my sleeves, settled in my elbows, and then in my mood. Work had always protected me because it asked one clear thing at a time. Lift this, brace that, mark this section unsafe. But that morning, each finished task opened a pocket where thought seeped in. Eli at 10, laughing because he'd hooked his own bootlace instead of a trout. Eli last month saying, "I'm kinda busy, Dad," in that careful tone kids use when they're trying not to be unkind. My father at 60, staring at a spread ledger and saying without looking up, "You don't earn trust by wanting it." I leaned my forehead against the shovel handle and shut my eyes. The lamp hiss filled my ears. I told myself I came here for permits and liability, for bolts and boards and county forms with signature lines. I told myself that story because it sounded respectable, like a man with his life in order. Underneath that, the truth was raw. I was angry at 2 men at once, one buried on the hill above the house, and one still alive who wore my own face in a mirror. I had wanted my father to admit he'd been hard in ways that did damage. I had wanted my son to forgive me for inheriting that hardness before I knew what to do with it. Wanting does not shore a tunnel. Wanting does not turn back water. I opened my eyes and kept shoveling because the alternative was to stand there and feel all of it at once. By the time the weak daylight at the portal had faded to a dim blue memory behind two bends, my wrists trembled with each lift, and my right knee had gone from complaint to warning. I set the shovel down, flexed my fingers until the cramps eased, and took my lunch pail back to the side chamber. The pail was where I'd left it, dent in the lid at 2 o'clock, black handle wrapped with old tape. I sat on an overturned powder crate and ate half a ham sandwich without tasting much. Wet wool and carbide and cold mud, that was the flavour of the morning. I drank coffee from the thermos and let it scald the front of my mouth, grateful for any sensation that wasn't memory. Daisy shifted once outside. A soft tack sound carried down the drift, then went still again. She had always told me with her feet what she wouldn't tolerate. When she panicked, she broadcast it to 3 counties. Now she stood like a carved figure in a church alcove. I should have taken that as information sooner. When I rose to hang my coat on a protruding bolt, my shoulder brushed the old bracket where a spare lantern used to sit, and metal clinked against metal. I turned fast enough to knock my lunch pail and swear under my breath. A carbide lantern rested in the bracket, flame steady, glass clean, giving off that familiar white gold burn I hadn't seen in years. It was my father's old backup, the one with a tiny dent near the fuel chamber, and a wire loop he'd repaired with solder so rough it looked like tree bark. I knew the lamp. I also knew I had looked straight at that empty bracket not long before, and felt relieved to find nothing there. I stepped closer until heat brushed my knuckles. The flame was real. The hiss was real. Beside it, fresh in the damped shale where the wall sloped, initials had been traced with a hard point. CC. Then a short diagonal line below, exactly the way he marked his sets. My mouth went dry in a way coffee couldn't fix. I actually said, "Excuse me," into the chamber like someone might be standing just past the edge of my light. And then I laughed once, short and embarrassed, because if anybody had seen me, I'd never live it down. A former shift boss apologizing to empty rock. That would feed the feed store stool crowd for a month. The laugh died quick. Nothing answered me but dripping water and 2 lamps hissing in different pitches, one on my cap and one on the wall, both undeniably lit. I checked the old lamp anyway with workman's hands because that was the only way I knew to keep from spinning up stories. Carbide chamber charged. No fresh corrosion on the cap threads. Burner tip unclogged. Whoever lit it had done it clean and knew what they were about. I held the lantern low and scanned the floor. In the clay strip near the chamber mouth, where runoff kept the surface soft, prints pressed in deep and clear. Not boots, no heel block, no lug pattern, no edge where leather met sole. Toes, broad forefoot, arch shallow but present. Bare and so large I set my own boot beside one and still had space at the front and back. The stride was measured and unhurried, angling past my work area with 4 full paces between impressions, as if whoever made them had been careful where to place weight. I followed them 10 yards before they faded across broken shale, then backtracked with my jaw set, refusing to call it what my first thought wanted to call it. Men played tricks. Teenagers snuck into abandoned cuts. Somebody could have carved false feet from rubber or green wood. I knelt and touched the edge of one track. The clay there held a crisp crumble where pressure had pushed moisture out, then settled. Fresh enough that water hadn't softened it back. Real enough that my fingertips came away with the exact shape of a toe ridge. I sat back on my heels and looked toward the adit. Daisy should have been dancing circles if a stranger had come near her lead rope. Instead, I heard her give one quiet exhale and a soft snort, the sound she made when a familiar hand reached her forehead. Back in the side chamber, more details waited like pieces laid out for a man too stubborn to see a pattern. Near the wet wall, where everything I'd stacked had been soaking through, sat a tight bundle of kindling no thicker than my wrist, bark peeled and wood dry as if it had been kept under shelter. I touched it twice to be sure. Dry. Beside the bend where I'd flagged a compromised upright, the snapped support that had been leaning uselessly now stood braced in place against the cap timber, wedged true enough to carry temporary load. I tried to move it and couldn't budge it with both hands. On top of my lunch pail lid, centered over the dent, someone had arranged 3 milky quartz chips in a neat cross. Points meeting. Not random spill. Deliberate. I did a full circuit then, methodical, because method had saved me more than luck ever did. I checked for extra lamp soot on the crown. None. I looked for boot edges outside the prints. None. I held my light high to catch any line where wire or rope had been used to lever that support. Nothing I could see. At the chamber mouth, airflow brushed my face from deeper in the drift, cool and steady, and with it came a smell outside the usual mine mix. Wet fur, crushed fern, and something animal but not rank, like hide dried in sun and rain. Both, not close, just present. The hair on my forearms lifted, not from fear so much as recognition that my categories had run out before the facts did. I took one of the quartz chips, weighed it in my palm, and set it back exactly where it had been. Then I carried the lit old lantern to a flat stone shelf and placed it where I could see it from the trench line. If this was a prank, it was the most competent and least harmful prank in county history. If it wasn't, I needed my hands free and my mind steadier than it felt. At the portal, Daisy stood square and calm, ears angled toward the timber above the adit, as if listening to a quiet instruction. She turned her head when she saw me, touched my shoulder with her muzzle, and went back to watching the trees. "Okay," I said to her, and to the mountain, and maybe to somebody I still couldn't name. "I see it." Then I went back underground, picked up the shovel, and started my next cut with the old lantern burning beside my father's initials. The next cut went easier than the first line had, and that alone should have told me I was not working by myself anymore. Gravel that had packed hard all morning now lifted in loose slabs, and the shallow trench I'd been forcing toward the side notch suddenly carried water in a smooth, narrow run. I paused with the shovel blade buried and watched it for a full 30 seconds. Flow was cleaner, less backwash, less pooling against the timber feet. Somebody had opened a relief channel farther down while I was in the side chamber with my sandwich, and my disbelief. I knew my own cuts. I knew the shape of a shovel edge and the lazy crescent it leaves when your wrist is tired. This channel had been scooped and scraped with a different geometry, longer pulls, careful grade, no wasted gouges. I should have felt dread. What I felt first was relief so sharp it embarrassed me. I kept working because work gave my nerves something to hold. Every few minutes I lifted my lamp and listened into the bend. The drift had gone oddly orderly, if that makes sense. Drips still fell. Water still moved. But the loose clatter I'd grown used to was gone, replaced by long pockets of stillness that seemed to gather ahead of me, then release after I passed. At one point, I set my gloves on a rail stub to clear mud from my knee brace. 10 minutes later, one glove was missing. I muttered to myself, retraced my steps, and found it laid flat on a dry rock shoulder at chest height, where no splash could reach it. Palm up, fingers straightened. I stood there with my hand on my hip and actually nodded like I'd been corrected by a foreman. "Appreciate that," I said out loud, then shook my head, because I was apparently the kind of man who thanked tunnels now. The humour of it lasted maybe half a minute. Then the facts returned and lined up in my mind with stubborn clarity. dry kindling where everything was soaked, a failed support set back true. A relit lantern I had not lit, prints too large for any boot prank I could imagine underground. And now drainage work done to the same standard I'd have expected from somebody who knew old headings and wet ground. I told myself there had to be a person behind it, a retired hand maybe, someone who remembered number 7 and had reasons for staying out of sight. That theory held for exactly as long as it took me to look again at the clay impressions near the chamber mouth. Bare, deep, even stride. Whoever left them had weight and balance that did not match any man I knew. I crouched, measured one with my folding ruler, and wrote the number in my field notebook anyway, because denial sometimes wears a hard hat and calls itself procedure. At the next bend, where the roof dipped and the cap timber had sagged since winter, I found another quiet correction waiting for me. The old drainage notch there had always been too narrow. Dad and I used to complain about it every spring and then postpone widening it because there was always a higher priority fix. Now the notch was open by another 6 inches and lined with 2 flat stones, angled just enough to keep the runoff from undercutting the wall. Not random, not brute force. Thoughtful. I stood with one boot in water, one boot on tie, and felt a strange lightness in my chest, the first I'd had in months. Grief didn't vanish. It just stepped back one pace while curiosity took the shovel from my hands. I told myself this couldn't be real in the way my mind first framed it. I told myself I was overtired, low on food, hearing patterns where there were only drips and echoes. I told myself a practical man does not build a new world view because of a lantern and some tracks. And while I told myself those things, another thought kept rising steady as pump pressure. If this is a trick, it's the kindest trick anybody ever played on me. If it isn't, then something large and deliberate is choosing not to frighten me when it has every advantage. I wanted to run those 2 truths against each other until one failed. But neither did. I just stood there in damp air, smelling shale and wet fur on the draft, and understood I was being asked to notice instead of explain. When I came out for air and to check Daisy, she greeted me with her usual shoulder bump and then looked past me toward the spoil pile. Her ears were forward, not stiff, not alarmed. I followed her gaze and saw a red fox picking its way along the edge of the tailings with that quick, neat trot they have. Something bright glinted near its hind leg, and my stomach dropped until I walked closer and saw a length of wire snare lying open in the mud, twisted apart at the loop like it had been pinched and peeled by hands far stronger than pliers. The fox paused, glanced once toward the timberline, then moved off clean, no limp. Daisy let out a soft breath and dropped her head to feed. The whole valley held that washed spring smell, cedar bark, cold runoff, wet rust from old rails. And for the first time since my father's funeral, I didn't feel like I was walking through a place that wanted nothing from me. By late afternoon, the rain came back in thin slant lines, so I buttoned my jacket, locked the tool chest, and drove down to Miller's Feed for carbide and 2 sacks of grain. Len Barlow was at the coffee barrel by the register, same brown cap he'd worn since I was 20, hands wrapped around a paper cup like he'd been born leaning there. He had retired from the county roads crew and now dispensed weather predictions and mild judgment in equal measure. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he'd seen anyone heading up Coleman Valley lately, maybe scavengers, maybe boys looking for a story. He squinted at me over the cup and said, "Not this weather. Folks avoid that slope in melt season. Why?" I said, "Found tracks in the drift. Big ones. Barefoot." He held my gaze another second, then shrugged without cruelty. "Mud does strange things to prints. You keep your roof up and your feet under you, Clint. That's enough excitement for one spring. I nodded like that settled it, paid for my supplies, and drove back up feeling more alone than when I'd gone down. 3 evenings into that week, I started checking the chamber corners the way some men check locks. I made small chalk marks on the wall at shoulder height, where only a person standing close would brush them, then left, and came back after dark, with fresh carbide. The marks nearest the narrowest squeeze were smeared low, as if something broad had turned sideways to pass, without touching the cap. New prints showed in the clay strip again, keeping to the outer edge of my lamp throw, never crossing directly into my boot path. That distance was not accidental. It was calibrated, and once I saw that, I could not unsee it. Whatever shared that drift with me was paying attention to what startled me and what didn't. I thought about Eli then, about how I'd been trying to force my way straight through every silence between us, and how this unseen thing was doing the opposite, holding space, waiting, not pushing. The first glimpse came just after I rounded the dogleg beyond set 12, where the flooded passage opened into a wider pocket that used to hold ore cars. My lamp bounced off moving dark mass, and at first my mind refused to pass it, because the scale was wrong. Then it steadied. An immense figure stood half-turned in the runoff, fur dark as soaked bark, shoulders nearly level with a beam I had to duck under every trip. He was not facing me head-on. He was working. 2 hands, each broad enough to span a shovel blade and then some, lifted slabby chunks of collapsed rock from the watercourse and set them aside with care that belonged in a carpenter's shop, not in a flooded mine. He moved slowly, almost exaggeratedly slow, like a man carrying hot coffee across a crowded room. I froze with 1 foot forward and the shovel handle loose in my grip. He paused too. Not stiff, not coiled, just still. Open posture, arms low, head angled slightly down as if trying to appear smaller in a place where that was physically out of reach. My pulse hit hard enough to blur the lamp fringe. I wanted to step back. I wanted to stare. I wanted, absurdly, to apologize for arriving mid-task. The figure eased 1 rock into place against the side trench, then another, redirecting the heaviest water away from the rotten timber base I'd been worrying over all week. The runoff changed course right in front of me, from a broad push to a controlled channel that left my work area mostly dry. I heard myself whisper, "Okay," and then louder, "Easy, I'm not going to rush you." My voice sounded thin in that space, but he did not flinch from it. There was no threat in him. That is the sentence I keep returning to, because words like huge and unknown pull people toward the wrong conclusion. He was enormous, yes, and close enough for me to see wet strands of fur clinging along his forearm and the dull amber brown of his eyes catching my lamp. But the prevailing fact in that moment was restraint. He never crowded me. He never advanced. He looked once at the compromised upright, once at the trench line, then at me, and stepped back 2 measured paces to widen the space between us. The resulting silence felt less like standoff and more like permission. I don't know how long we stayed that way, both of us listening to water settle into the route he'd made. My breathing eased first. Then my shoulders dropped. I set the shovel down, palms out where he could see them, and nodded toward the side trench like we were 2 crewmen agreeing on a plan. He tilted his head once, a small acknowledgement, and turned back to the rubble. What came next was almost comical in its gentleness. He picked up a rail tie end that would have taken me a pry bar and bad language, shifted it 3 feet, and laid it down without a bang. I gave 1 short laugh I couldn't help. "I spent an hour on that this morning," I said, and felt foolish and grateful at the same time. A few pebbles clicked down from the crown. He glanced up immediately, then moved to the safer side of the chamber and waited there, body angled so I could pass if I wanted out. That was when belief finally crossed whatever line disbelief had drawn in me. Not because of prints or lights or stories from old men on feed store stools, but because this great animal understood caution as a shared language. He had seen my fear, adjusted to it, and kept working where the work needed doing. I picked the shovel back up, and with him, at respectful distance, deepened the trench he had started. Water followed it cleanly. The drift breathed easier. So did I. While I worked, I heard myself form the sentence plain as a checklist item. Tonight, I write Eli. No speeches, no excuses, just the truth, and an open door. When I finally backed toward the portal with my tools and my legs shaking from more than labor, he remained in the half-light beyond set 12, one hand resting on the stone shoulder, watching without pressing forward. At the last bend, I turned once more. He was still there, immense and steady. Then he stepped behind the timberline and was gone so quietly. The only proof was the new channel carrying meltwater away from the failing support, and the broad barefoot prints deepening in the clay where he had stood. I stood at the last bend longer than made sense, lamp lowering inch by inch, as if my arm had forgotten whose body it belonged to. Watching those broad prints fill slowly with seep water, until each one held a pale oval reflection of my light. Then I turned and walked the rest of the way out, careful not to step in them, careful not to hurry like a man fleeing something. At the adit mouth, Daisy lifted her head from the feed pan and gave me that steady look she saved for days when I was the one acting skittish. Rain ticked on the overhang. The valley had gone blue with evening. I untied her, set my hand on her neck, and felt the slow pulse under her hide while I looked back into the dark cut in the mountain and tried to fit new facts into old shelves. At the cabin, I stripped off wet gear, fed the stove, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open to a page full of measurements that no longer helped me much. Print length, stride spacing, depth in clay. I added one more line in block letters. Did not approach. Kept distance. Then I stared at it until the ink feathered in the cheap paper. Practical men like me build our calm from categories, and my categories had started slipping. Animal, man, prank, accident, runoff. None of them held everything I had seen in that flooded pocket at set 12. I made coffee too late in the day, drank it anyway, and finally pulled my phone close before I could talk myself out of it. I called Eli and got him this time on the 4th ring. "Hey," he said, voice thin with game noise in the background. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm okay. You busy?" "Sort of. We're mid-round." "Got it. I won't keep you. I'm up at number 7 doing closure work this week. Place is wetter than I've ever seen it. I just wanted to hear your voice for a minute. Wanted to ask if maybe you'd come up Sunday if weather breaks. I can show you where your granddad used to keep the tags and maps." He was quiet long enough for me to hear him mute something on his end. "Maybe," he said. "Mum's got me Saturday. Sunday could work. You sound tired, Dad." "I am tired," I said, "but I'm trying to do better than tired and quiet all the time." Another pause, softer this time. "Okay, text me tomorrow?" "I will." When he hung up, the room felt less hollow. Not fixed, just less empty at the edges. Later, the rain eased to a fine mist that sat in the fir branches like breath, and I climbed back to the adit with fresh carbide, 2 dry sandwiches, and a stubborn intent not to flinch at my own shadow. I tied Daisy in the same spot under the overhang. She leaned into the halter rope once, then settled square, ears pointed toward the drift like she had an appointment. "You and me both," I muttered and stepped inside. The old lantern was still on the stone shelf where I had left it, burned out now, cold to the touch. My cap lamp hissed steady. Water moved in the side trench with a cleaner line than earlier, and at each trouble point where I expected backwash, someone had already laid flat rock like little spillways. Not pretty, effective. I set one sandwich on a dry board near the side chamber entrance, mostly to see what I was doing inside my own head, and then felt foolish enough to clear my throat and say into the drift, "For crew, I guess." 30 seconds later, I added, "I know that sounds ridiculous." Underground, your own voice comes back at you thin and practical, and that helped. I worked my way towards set 12 with shovel and pry bar, calling out before each blind corner the same way we used to on active headings. Coming around left. Tools in hand. Watch your toes, which made me snort at myself because if those feet had toes worth watching, mine were pebbles by comparison. The unusual stillness met me each time just before I turned, and each time I found signs of recent work. Rubble shifted clear of flow, soft clay pressed by large bare tracks along the outer arc, where my light barely reached. One snapped board replaced with a sounder length from the salvage pile. No rush marks, no torn-up ground. Whoever moved through there had enough power to wreck half the drift, and chose precision instead. At the dogleg near the flooded pocket, I heard him before I saw him, a deep, deliberate movement of rock against rock, spaced with long pauses as if he was checking whether I was still calm. My breath shortened anyway. I set the pry bar down so metal wouldn't clang, raised my open hands, and took one careful step into the wider chamber. He stood in profile 10 yards off, shoulders dark and broad against wet shale. One hand resting on a slab he had just eased from the runoff channel. His head turned toward me. Amber-brown eyes caught the lamp fringe and held steady. I remember the exact shape of my thoughts then because they came in one clear, present tense line after another. This can't fit what I know. I am not in danger. He is waiting on me. I wanted to run, but something made me stay, and that something wasn't bravado. It was the way he shifted his weight back, not forward, giving me room before I asked for it. I had seen frightened men fake calm underground and fail by their third breath. This was not that. This was mutual caution, offered and returned. "All right," I said, voice low. "I'm here to clear the notch on my side. You keep yours." He dipped his head once, small and almost formal, and resumed working. What struck me most was not his size, though every time he moved a rail tie chunk, my brain did the math and quit halfway through. It was his restraint at that size. He picked through rubble with fingertips broad as my palm, selecting pieces, setting them down with barely a click. When the trench wall sloughed near my boot, he froze until I stepped clear, then shifted one stone to re-angle the flow away from me. We worked like that for the better part of an hour, never close enough to touch, never out of each other's awareness. At one point, my cap lamp guttered from spray and dimmed. I cursed, crouched to shield it, and heard a soft tap to my right. On a dry lip of rock sat my spare match tin, the one I had been certain I left in my coat by the chamber. Beside it lay my missing glove, fingers neatly straightened. I laughed once despite myself. "You're better organized than I am," I said, and this time the words didn't feel absurd. They felt like acknowledging a co-worker who had already seen through my bluff. As the hours wore on, spring melt turned mean in the higher cuts. You could hear the creak from the portal now without straining, a hard, continuous rush under everything else. I made a quick run out, shifted salvage boards from the truck bed up under the overhang for emergency bracing, then carried a dented tin box into the side chamber and set it on the driest shelf I could find. The box held things I had no business losing to water. My father's brass check tag, 2 snapshots gone soft at the corners, and 3 letters to Eli I had written over the past year and never mailed, because each one sounded like a defense brief halfway through. I told myself I'd sort it that night, decide what stayed with me and what went to the burn barrel, then take the rest home. The truth was I wanted those pages near me while I worked, like a man keeping a compass in his shirt pocket even when the sky is clear. Rain thickened again toward dusk, warm and steady, and by the time I reached set 10, the side seep had doubled. I could feel humidity thick in my lungs, and my lamp flame pulled long when I moved fast. At the fork beyond the old ore pocket, I started toward the lower passage out of habit, the route I'd used for years to inspect the far supports. 3 paces in, a crossed pair of quartz chips caught my eye on the ground ahead, bright against mud, placed dead center in my line. I stopped, frowned, nudged one aside with my boot, and took another step. My lamp flame thinned again, wavering blue at the tip. Bad air. I backed out 2 strides and crouched to test with a match. The flame lit, then shrank and died as if pinched. Not enough oxygen in that pocket to trust another 10 feet. My stomach rolled cold. I had been tired and distracted, and tired men make final mistakes underground. When I stood, a gentle scrape sounded from the upper root. He was there in the half-dark, not blocking me, just waiting near the safer passage with one hand resting on the wall. He looked toward the upper tunnel, then at me, and stepped back to widen the opening. "Copy that," I said, because old habits run deep and gratitude often comes out in work language first. "Upper line it is." He moved ahead at a measured pace, far enough to keep space, close enough that I never lost sight of him when the lamp bounced. Every 100 feet or so he paused and touched the wall where seep lines glistened, then continued, guiding me along the dry shoulder he had been improving with flat stones and clear footing. At the worst squeeze, where roof rock had started to shed flakes, he ducked through and then stood off to the side while I passed, head lowered, arms loose. It is widely argued that trust arrives in one big dramatic moment. My experience was the opposite. Trust arrived as a chain of small choices made carefully over and over until disbelief had no useful work left to do. Near the adit mouth I heard Daisy before I saw her. One short, worried whicker and a hoof scuff against wood. I quickened my pace and came out to find runoff from the slope, cutting a new channel under the hitch post. The post had leaned, rope twisted, and Daisy stood, braced with her front feet apart. Not panicked yet, but one hard pull away from a tangle that could wrench a shoulder. I dropped my shovel and moved for her halter, boots sliding in wet clay. He emerged from the drift behind me but stayed wide, giving me the lead. Then, as Daisy shifted and the rope cinched tighter around the leaning post, he stepped to the far side, knelt slow enough for her to track every movement, and put one huge hand on the post base. He held it steady while I worked the knot loose, not yanking, not forcing, just bracing 20 times the weight I could manage so my fingers could do their small work. Daisy's ears flicked once toward him, then back to me, calm returning in visible increments. I got the rope free, retied her to a fir root out of runoff, and looked up. "Thank you," I said, breathless and muddy and fully aware how inadequate those 2 words were. He released the post gently, set it flat clear of her feet, and reached to the truck bed where I'd left the 2 grain sacks under a tarp that was already sliding off. With one controlled lift, he carried both sacks under the overhang and set them on dry boards beside her feed pan, then stepped back several paces and lowered his gaze so I wouldn't read challenge where there was none. Kindness that practical is hard to misread. It wasn't theatre. It was aimed straight at what mattered to me. For a long moment, we stood in rain noise and creek roar, 3 living bodies under a mountain overhang sharing one narrow pocket of shelter. Daisy breathed slow and even. My chest shook once, then steadied. I realized I was crying only when rain stopped blurring, and my eyes did. I wiped my face with my sleeve and laughed softly at myself. I once gave a safety lecture about never trusting unknown variables, I said. You would have failed that class and still saved the crew. He watched me with that same calm, amber-brown attention, then turned toward the timberline above the adit. At the edge of the trees he paused and looked back once. I lifted my hand, palm out, not as command or plea, just acknowledgement. He dipped his head, then moved uphill through wet fir shadow so quietly that within seconds the only sign he had been there was a run of deep, barefoot prints in the clay, and 2 dry grain sacks under shelter, where I should have put them in the first place. I stayed with Daisy another 10 minutes until my breathing settled and her rope sat right. Then I carried the tin box from the side chamber to the truck cab, tucked it behind the seat where floodwater couldn't touch it, and drove down to the house in full dark with the wipers knocking steady time. At the kitchen table, with mud still drying on my cuffs, I opened the first unsent letter to Eli, crossed out 3 defensive lines, and wrote what I should have written months earlier. I miss you. I get things wrong when I'm scared. I'm trying to learn a better way while there's still time. Then I folded it clean, addressed it, and set it by the door so I could not pretend to forget in the morning. I left the envelope by the door and kept my hand on it a second longer than I needed to, fingertips resting over Eli's name like I could hold that small decision in place, by pressure alone. The stove clicked and settled behind me. Rain brushed the window in soft passes, not hard enough to drown the creek, just enough to keep the valley sounding awake. I went back to the table, sat down, and pulled the tin box close. The brass check tag lay on top where I had dropped it, dull gold in the lamplight. My father's number worn smooth at one edge from years in his pocket, and now mine. I turned it over once, then again, and all at once the careful stacking I had been doing in my chest for months gave way. I cried with both hands over my face like a tired kid, elbows on a scarred kitchen table, boots still on, mud drying in flakes by my chair legs. It wasn't one clean emotion. It was grief, relief, shame, gratitude, anger, and a strange kind of peace that hurt on the way in, because I hadn't made room for it. I was crying for my father, who taught me steadiness and left me no map for tenderness. I was crying for my son, who had learned to measure his words with me, because I made honest talk feel like a safety inspection. I was crying because a creature big enough to break me in half had spent days showing me how to handle fear without making it somebody else's burden. The world had gone wider under my boots, and I had no practiced language for that. By the time the stove burned down to deep red coals, my breathing had slowed and my shirt front had dried stiff where tears and rain had mixed. I opened the tin and read the old letters one by one. The first was full of explanations nobody had asked for. The second was half apology, half lecture. Exactly the kind of thing I used to hear from my father when he was trying to feel less exposed. The third was better, and still not good enough. I set each page aside and started a fresh one, writing slow in block letters at first, so my hand would keep pace with what I meant. Eli, I am done pretending work is why I keep distance. I get scared of saying the wrong thing, then I say nothing, and nothing does more damage. I miss your jokes. I miss hearing about your day. I want to learn you as you are now, not as a memory I keep polishing. I stopped there, rubbed my eyes and laughed once at myself, quiet and tired. I had spent years underground solving load paths and water problems, then sat in my own kitchen stunned by a single true sentence. I wrote another page, This one to my father, though he would never read it. I told him where I was still angry. I told him what I had copied from him that I wanted to keep, and what I needed to set down before it reached another generation. I told him he had loved us in work and provision, and never learned the other dialect, and that I had judged him for that, while speaking the same dialect to my own boy. When I finished, my hand shook less than when I started. A sharp hoof scrape sounded outside. Daisy, one quick warning tap against the porch post, then stillness. I stood, carried the old relit lantern from the counter, and stepped out under the eave. Mist moved through the yard in thin grey sheets. The valley smelled of wet earth and alder bark, and the creek below the shed had climbed another few inches, loud and hurried in the dark. Daisy stood near the lean-to, ears forward toward the upper track. Not alarmed, attentive. I lifted the lantern and followed her line of sight. At the edge where yard gave way to timber, he stood half in shadow, broad shoulders dark against paler trunks, rain beading along the fur on his arms. He was farther back than before, maybe 30 yards, giving me room in a way that had become familiar. He did not move toward the house. He did not pace. One huge hand opened and closed once at his side, then settled. There was no drama in it, just presence. I stayed under the eave, lantern low so the light didn't stab at him. I wrote him, I said into the rain, voice rough from crying. I actually wrote him straight. The words sounded plain and small in that wide night, but saying them out loud made them real. He tilted his head a fraction, eyes catching a warm glint from the lantern glass. The expression on that face wasn't human and still made immediate sense to me. Watchful, calm, patient, without being distant. My chest tightened again, then opened. I wiped my nose on my sleeve like a man with no audience and no pride left to defend. I was mad at being left, I said. Mad long after the reasons changed. Mad at my dad for dying before we fixed things. Mad at my kid for needing space. Mad at myself for earning that space. I kept calling it stress. It was grief with work boots on. Daisy shifted behind me and gave a soft breath, as if agreeing with something she had known all week. He listened the way mountains listen, completely, without interruption, without offering to solve what only I could solve. That steadiness let the last hard knot in me loosen. I cried again, quieter this time, not from collapse but from release, like pressure finally finding the valve meant for it. Rain tapped the lantern hood. Water ran off the roof in a silver line 3 feet from my boots. I stood there and let the moment be unpolished and true. After a while, he lowered himself to a crouch near the tree line, not hiding, just making himself less overwhelming in the open yard. With careful fingers, he placed something on the ground in front of him, then leaned back and waited. I could see only pale shapes at first. Quartz chips. 4 this time, arranged in a cross with 1 extra stone set just off center, like a marker for a route choice. He looked from the stones to me, then toward the upper trail to number 7, then back. Not command, suggestion. Drainage check, I said, understanding the practical language we had built. You want me to see it tonight? He stood again, gave me 1 clear look, and stepped uphill 2 paces before stopping to make sure I followed by choice, not pressure. I went inside, pulled on my shell, took a pry bar and 2 short boards, then came back out and touched Daisy's neck. Stay dry, girl. I'll be quick. She stayed calm, head low, eyes on me, then on him. Trust moving between us like a tool passed hand to hand. The climb in mist felt longer than it was. He kept well ahead, visible only when my lantern found the curve of a shoulder or the flash of wet fur between trunks. Every time the trail narrowed, he moved to the outside edge and paused until I was through. At the adit, runoff had bitten deeper under the ditch lip, just enough to threaten the hitch area again by morning if left alone. He waited back while I set the boards, drove them in with a rock maul, and packed clay against the seam. When I struggled to seat the second board against a stubborn root, he stepped in only after I nodded, pressed the plank with 2 fingers, and held it steady until my wedge caught. Precision, then distance again. Inside number 7, the air carried that mixed smell of stone, carbide, and clean cold water. The side trench still ran true, but a fresh slough near set 9 had started to shed into the flow. He had already stacked flat rock nearby in a neat pile sized to my reach, each piece selected like he knew exactly what my back could handle and what it couldn't. We worked in companionable silence, me placing, him passing from a respectful gap. Once my lamp beam crossed his hands full on. They were immense, scarred in old pale lines, and moving with the gentleness of someone setting a sleeping animal down. By a little after midnight, the slough was faced, the waterline was stable, and the worst pressure had bled off into the side notch. I leaned on my shovel, lungs burning in that good, exhausted way, and looked down the drift, where the old lantern sat on the shelf by my father's initials. Its flame had burned low but steady through the whole job. I took off my glove and laid my palm over the shale mark, CC, then over my own chest, a gesture I would have mocked 6 months earlier. It felt right tonight. He was waiting in the wider pocket near set 12 when I turned back, posture loose, no sign of hurry. I stepped to where the clay still held his prints and set 1 quartz chip from my pocket at the edge, not in the track, just beside it. "For crew," I said again, a little smile in my voice this time. "And for the record, you've got better shift manners than half the men I came up with." He dipped his head once, that same small, formal motion, and then the farewell came exactly like everything else with him. Deliberate, unadorned, kind. He stepped backward 3 paces so I had the clear center line to the portal. He turned sideways through the narrow squeeze to avoid brushing me as we passed. At the last bend he paused where my light still reached, glanced back with those calm, amber-brown eyes, and then moved beyond the timber sets into dark that was only dark. No spectacle, no sudden sound, no demand to be followed. I stood listening to the drift settle around me, drips counting off the roof, runoff taking the route we had cut, my own breath finally even. When I reached the adit mouth, mist had thinned, and the cloud deck was breaking in ragged seams over the ridge. The clay just outside held a fresh line of huge barefoot prints for 20 feet, then nothing where the ground turned to stone. Beside the last clear impression sat a final arrangement of quartz, 2 crossed pieces and 1 set above them, simple as a trail sign, bright as bone in lantern light. I did not call after him. There was nothing to ask for that hadn't already been given. I picked up the top quartz chip, warm from my palm after a moment, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I walked down to the house, checked Daisy, banked the stove, and set both letters, 1 to my son, 1 to my father, on the table where morning would find them without argument. Morning came thin and pale through the kitchen window, and for once I did not argue with it. I made coffee, warmed yesterday's biscuit in a pan, and sat with both letters where I could see them while the kettle hissed. The envelope to Eli was sealed and stamped. The page to my father stayed folded without an address, his name on the front in block print like I was still a boy trying to write neatly at his bench. I slid Eli's letter into my jacket pocket, took the brass check tag and set it beside my keys, then lifted the relit lantern from the counter and checked it in full daylight. Burner clean, chamber dry, solder scar on the loop exactly where I remembered it from Dad's hand. I touched the dent near the base and felt the same steadiness I had felt underground, the practical comfort of an object that had done its job when mine had failed. By 9, I was at the post office in town, boots leaving damp marks on the old tile from valley mud that never quite lets go. I fed Eli's letter through the slot myself and listened for it to land. That small sound hit me harder than I expected. I stood there another second, then stepped outside and sent the text I had promised. Mailed you something real this time. No speeches. Just wanted you to have it. I'm at county office by noon about ceiling number 7. You're still welcome Sunday. My thumb hovered over send because old habits die like stubborn roots. Then I sent it and put the phone away before I could edit my own honesty into something safer. The county building smelled like printer toner and wet coats. Roy Jensen from Mine Safety met me in the hallway with a clipboard tucked under his arm, and that expression officials wear when they expect trouble but hope for paperwork. We sat in a narrow office with a map of abandoned claims on the wall, red pins thick along the melt lines. I laid out my notebook, closure notice, and measurements of seep rates, support conditions, and trench angles. Roy listened, asked direct questions, and wrote fast. You saying immediate hazard? He asked. I'm saying spring runoff moved 2 weeks early. Set 9 and 12 are compromised, and if we leave the lower drift open, someone gets hurt. You can keep an interpretive entrance if we barricade and backfill right. You want that? I do. It was my father's claim. I want it safe, not erased. He tapped the pen against my notebook where I had sketched the drainage trench. This reroute bought you time. It did, I said. Enough to do it right. I did not hand him the page with the print measurements. I had written them, photographed them, and then put that sheet in the tin with family papers before I left the house. Some evidence belongs in a file. Some belongs in a life. Roy and 2 county hands came up with me that afternoon in a flatbed loaded with treated posts, fencing, and warning signs. The rain had eased to high cloud, and Coleman Valley looked scrubbed raw and honest, every seep line visible down the slope. Daisy watched from the lean-to while we staged tools at the adit. Roy crouched by the clay apron near the portal, running his tape over the deepest impressions still holding shape where shade had kept them from slumping. He gave me a quick look, not mocking, not convinced, just thoughtful. Big tracks, he said. Yeah, I answered. Bear doesn't leave toes like that in this angle, he said, then stood and dusted his knees. Ground's weird in melt season. I'm logging unidentified impressions. That work for you? It does. He never came back to it, and I respected that. By late day we had steel mesh set inside the mouth, drainage ditch armoured with the boards I'd staged, and warning placards bolted where teenagers couldn't miss them. We left a shallow memorial alcove just beyond the first safe bend, dry and lit enough for family visits, and sealed the dangerous sections beyond with fill and rockfall net. I carried the tin out before final closure and showed Roy every item for inventory. Brass tag, 2 snapshots, 3 old unsent drafts, 1 field notebook, 1 loose page of airflow tests, 1 quartz chip. He initialed the property list. I signed transfer to personal custody, and that thread of my life was tied clean. At dusk, after the crew drove out, I walked back to the adit alone. The mesh gate held solid. The side trench still moved water where it needed to go. On the flat stone just outside the barrier sat a new cross of quartz chips, 5 this time, centered and precise. No fresh prints led in or out. The clay had crusted, and stones started 3 feet beyond. I crouched, touched the top chip, and left 4 where they were. 1 went into my pocket beside the brass tag. We're closed, I said to the quiet. Safe now. Thank you for the shift work. The firs answered with wind and nothing else, which felt exactly right. Sunday broke clear for the first time all week. Sky washed blue between ridges with snow still tucked in high shade. Eli came up just after 10 in his mother's car, shoulders narrow in a hoodie he'd nearly outgrown, trying hard to look neutral and older than 15. I met him at the porch, and we did that awkward half-hug men do when they have history to cross before comfort. He smelled like laundry soap and peppermint gum. I offered coffee for me, cocoa for him, and we sat at the same scarred table where I had cried 2 nights earlier. He pulled my letter from his pocket, folded and reopened enough times to soften the edges. I read it twice, he said. Okay. It sounded like you, just not armored. I let that land. Fair. He looked toward the counter where the lantern sat. That your dad's? Yeah, relit in the drift when mine went out. He studied my face to see if I was joking. I held still. You really mean that? He said quietly. I do. We walked up to number 7 together before noon, Daisy trailing us loose like she had appointed herself trail supervisor. At the memorial alcove, I showed him the carved CC in shale, told him which one had been his granddad and which one had ended up mine, and handed him the brass check tag. He weighed it in his palm the way I had so many times, thumb rubbing the worn edge. I don't know if I can wear this, he said. You don't have to wear it. Keep it, box it, toss it someday. It's yours if you want it. He nodded and slipped it into his pocket. Near the mesh, he spotted the quartz arrangement and crouched. You put these here? Some, not all. He gave me a long, side glance that held skepticism and curiosity in equal measure, then set one fingertip on the top stone. Mom says people see what they need when they're hurting. She's not wrong, I said. I needed to see kindness and not miss it this time. He stood and kicked at a pine cone. Did it scare you? I answered plain. At first, yeah, then less. It kept distance, helped with water, bad air, Daisy and me being too stubborn to quit. He looked out over the valley for a while before speaking again. I was mad at you, he said. Still am some days. But I didn't want you gone. Just different. I swallowed once. That's fair too. I can do different better than gone. We spent the afternoon doing ordinary work that felt new because we were both present for it. He helped me mount the lantern above the mantel on 2 lag screws and a cedar backboard. We labelled the tin box together. Coleman claim papers, personal. Inside it went the snapshots in sleeves, my field notebook, airflow page, and the 3 old unsent drafts marked void across the top so they could not quietly become the only record. The valid letter was already in his pocket. The quartz chip I kept sat on the mantel under the lantern, not as proof for anyone else, just as a reminder to me that scale and gentleness can share one body. Before he left, we drove to the hill cemetery above town, where my father's stone faced west over the same ridges that held number 7. Wind moved dry grass in low waves around our boots. I set the unmailed letter to Dad under a small rock at the base of the marker and read 2 lines out loud, voice steady. You were good at carrying weight. I forgive what you couldn't carry. Eli stood beside me with hands in his pockets, not fidgeting, just there. When we walked back to the car, he bumped my shoulder once and said, You can text more than weather, you know. I laughed and said, I can learn. That night the valley settled into clear cold, creek lower by an inch, stars sharp over the fir line. I fed Daisy, banked the stove, and sat in the porch chair with a blanket over my knees, and no urge to fill the silence with noise. The world was still hard. Timber still rotted if you ignored water. Men still missed each other by inches if they let fear do the talking. None of that changed. What changed was the underlying measure I used for the days. I no longer read every quiet stretch as absence. Sometimes quiet meant space being held. Sometimes help arrived without wanting a name on it. Sometimes the right thing was done at a respectful distance and left there like dry kindling by a wet wall. I still do not argue about what he was. If somebody asks, I tell them what happened and let their framework do what it does. A lantern went dead and then burned clean. Barefoot prints bigger than my forearm crossed clay and stopped at stone. A fox walked free of wire. Bad air was marked before I breathed it. A mule trusted first. A father mailed the letter. A son answered. Number 7 is sealed, safe, and no longer a wound I keep reopening to prove I can stand pain. On the mantel, the relit lantern throws a soft circle each evening, and the quartz below it catches that light without asking for credit. I carry both kinds of evidence now, what I can hold in my hand and what I can finally hold in my life.